And yeah, let's get started. So a bit of an introduction. Well, first off, my name's Roger Lights. I started the Mosquito project back in 2009 and have been the project lead and primary developer of Mosquito since then. I'm now fortunate to be paid to work on Mosquito by Sedalo. I'm working as a senior developer there. And as well as sponsoring Mosquito, Sedalo are also the creators of the Eclipse Stream Sheets project, which is a kind of pretty complementary project to Mosquito, which gives you a no-code environment for producing your own applications that can process data streaming from a variety of data sources, including MQTT, and you use a spreadsheet interface to build that application and dashboard and that sort of thing. And that then runs continuously as a microservice wherever you deploy it. Just to show you this, because it may be of interest to some people. So this is an example stream sheet, which is simulating a wind power plant. So it's generating some simulated data on wind speed, and then the orange and blue cells on the left-hand side then are helping to convert that into the appropriate JSON payload that we then publish to an MQTT broker. And if this was a real thing, then we'd see all of those values changing in real time as the data comes in and is processed, and the graphic of the wind turbine rotating, and we can make gauges and indicators, graphs, all sorts of things in these stream sheets. So that's something to search for if that catches your fancy. But onto the real topic for today, Mosquito 2.0. And so these are the different subjects that I'm going to cover: security, performance, the new plugin interface, and the dynamic security plugin that goes along with that, management center, and then bridge improvements, and a final very brief look at some of the new features in the Mosquito clients. So security first, because that's important. So we changed the Mosquito security in a couple of ways. So the first one is probably the least impactful for most people, and what that is on Linux type, Unix type systems, we drop any root privileges that we have much sooner than we would have done. The file is potentially read as in previous, the pages will be dropped after things like the listeners and just before the main loop was started. So this isn't quite so much a security upgrade as a means of ensuring that all of the files that we need access to on reload will remain to be accessible by the Mosquito user. It's kind of forcing the person using the broker to make sure all of these permissions are correct before they can get the broker running, rather than running into problems later on. One of those examples that's probably going to hit a few people is with Let's Encrypt certificates, because they are only accessible by root in their default location. But luckily they have post-renewal hooks that you can specify scripts to deal with to copy them to an appropriate place. So we've tried to help provide a script and suggestions of how to get around these issues that are going to come around because of that. The much bigger change is around listener authentication behavior. And I mean, essentially, since the start of the Mosquito project, it's always been very open. Whenever you start Mosquito, it would be straight away listening on a network port, open to whatever part of the network it was listening on. The broker was running on, and anyone would be able to connect unauthenticated. And that's obviously fantastic if you want to do testing, and get up and running quickly. But there's the all too greater risk there that people would leave the broker unconfigured in terms of security. So we're trying to change that and make it so that the the end user of the broker has to consider security. And they do have the option, of course, to going back to that fully open policy, but they've then got to make that active decision. So the changes that we've made are that remote access will not be allowed by default. You have to configure that, and anonymous or unauthenticated access is also not going to be allowed by default. You have to configure that as well. And so I'll just go over those different scenarios just to make that particularly clear, hopefully. So here we've got two computers, the one with the broker on and then a remote computer. And both of those two computers have also got an anonymous client, so we're not using authentication, and one that is using authentication. So if we start the broker without any listener configuration at all, so maybe just from the command line, just typing Mosquito, or if you have a configuration file, but it doesn't have any listener configuration, then this is the situation that you'll be presented with. You'll be able to connect from the local computer with an anonymous client, but nothing from a remote computer. So that means you can do testing, the build tests, continuous integration will still run, for example, for our side of things, and anybody wanting to do testing on their local machine will be fine. Now, I've said that you can't connect with an authenticated client, and in fact, if you provide a username and password, then that will just get ignored. So it will still be allowed to connect, but no authentication is actually occurring. Now, if we do define a listener configuration, then that immediately allows connections from remote computers. But if we haven't defined any authentication, then that means clients won't be able to connect. So the act of defining the listener to allow remote connections turns off that anonymous access, which was allowed in the previous slide. So what we have to do, of course, is define some authentication. So as soon as we've done that, then we can connect either from a local computer or remote computer with our authenticated clients, as you would expect. So it's a small change, and I'm sure it's going to affect a few people, but I think you probably would agree that this is only a small amount of difficulty for someone to overcome to carry on. Of course, we can use anonymous access as well. So if you want to have a fully open broker, that's perfectly possible. Just set allow anonymous true in your configuration file, define a listener, and that will work as you would expect. And then finally, you can do mixed access, so a mix of both authenticated and anonymous clients. And depending on then the authorization that you use, you'll be able to separate those two classes of clients from one another. Okay. So that covers the security aspect. And I'll just say at this point, if any of the points that you want to raise a question about, then you can use the question and answer feature, of course, and I will keep on giving the presentation, and then we can get to those questions at the end, and there'll be some time for those questions anyway, if you think of questions afterwards. So performance. One of the my real aims for version 2.0 was to improve performance for a number of clients. If you are using Mosquito with a number of thousands, this may not going to impact you, but the improvement that we've done in scaling to larger has really improved dramatically. And the plan is to publish some proper benchmarks in the future, but you can appreciate it's a reasonable undertaking to produce rigorous tests covering a wide variety of scenarios. So I haven't got those yet, but I can share some informal results at the moment. You may have seen this on Twitter if you follow the Mosquito account. This was a test where I connected over just a little bit over a million, just over 1 million clients to a single Mosquito instance that was running on a general purpose droplets, DigitalOcean droplets, and then a couple of other droplets that were connecting these clients, these over 1 million clients, to the Mosquito instance. And in this case, the clients are only acting as subscribers, so there was no messages being published, and they used a 300-second keep alive. So they're really not doing a very great deal, but even so, 1 million clients is a lot, and it was very pleasing to see that we were getting around 5% CPU usage and around 800 megabytes of RAM usage, and this certainly wouldn't have been possible on Mosquito 1.6. Another test, slightly different, was a similar sort of setup. One droplet with a broker on, and then a second droplet with 28,000 publishers, and a third with a single subscriber. And each of the publishers in these tests were publishing a message every 2 seconds, and they were all publishing to their own unique topic, and the subscriber was subscribing to the hash topic, so receiving every single message. So what we would expect is to see a publish rate of 14,000 messages per second, and also a subscribe rate of 14,000 messages per second. And so I've got a comparison on the next slide between Mosquito 1.6 and 2.0. So just looking on the right-hand side of the screen in the first instance, so we've got the two different message rates as we are increasing the number of clients up to the 28,000, and you can see in both cases it hits the 14,000 messages per second for both publishing and subscribing. That's the sort of pinky purple and pale blue that are overlaid on top of one another on the right hand side, and so that's all working fine from that point of view. But now if we look on the left hand side of the screen, there is the CPU usage for the two different brokers, and on the bottom hand you see the Mosquito 1.6 is just shy of hitting 100% CPU usage, whereas Mosquito 2.0 is sort of 15–16% CPU usage. So it's pretty substantial improvements there. I was particularly pleased with that. And as I say, we're planning on doing further benchmarks that are somewhat more rigorous than what you can see here, and covering further scenarios. This was, I think this was QoS 0 messages. So another new feature is the change in a plugin interface. So we've had a plugin interface for quite a long time now. The existing interface is pretty much exclusively for authentication and authorization. I can just spot the question that's come in there. Does the 1.6 graph show a crash? No, it doesn't. That was just where the publisher was stopped. The tool. So yeah, that was all that was. Yeah, so the plugin interface, the existing one is only for authentication and authorization, and it required every single plugin to implement all of the different features, all of the different functions at least, and it was just a little bit more difficult to deal with than the new interface, which solves those problems a bit. So importantly, the existing interface is still supported in 2.0, so any plugins that already have been written will continue to function just fine, and there should be no functional difference between them, really, apart from the lack of the extra features that we have. So the new interface gives us more features, not just authentication and authorization, and it's easier to implement. You only need to create 3 different functions to interact with the plugin, and then choose which features you want to use. And so that makes it easier for the plugin developer's point of view, but it's also more straightforward for us to extend the interface, without having to change the versioning of the plugin interface again. So these are the different events that you can register your interest in as a plugin. The top 4 there, the basic authentication, extended authentication, ACL check, and TLS pre-shared key authentication, are essentially what was available in the existing plugin interface, and the bottom 5 are the additions. So the first one of those is the client disconnect. So you can you get information both about the client, about the start of the client session through the authentication, and also the end of the session. Periodic tick event, preload event. I think the bottom 2 are perhaps the more interesting. So install and modify any messages that have been to a certain extent in the ACL check events, where you're able to look at payloads already, perhaps verify that the format is what you require for a particular topic. But this new event will also allow you to modify messages. Now, obviously, this is a bit of a stick that you could hit yourself with in an awkward way. So you have to be very careful with it, and it's not necessarily something I would be recommending people do as a matter of course, but there are definitely some situations where this is going to prove useful. So one of the examples that came up on the issue tracker was a person who wanted to work with some existing MQTT devices that they had, where it was really important for the subscriber to know when a retained message had been, the time at which a retained message had been published, so it knew how stale it was. But the devices that were doing the publishing, they couldn't modify, and the payload didn't have that information in. So I've produced an example plugin which will add an MQTT v5 property to every single message that is published to the broker. And so that adds it's a user property type property, which just adds a timestamp of when the message was received by the broker. So then subsequently, any MQTT v5 clients that connect and subscribe to that topic will receive the message, and it will have that property, and they'll know how stale that message is. And the whole thing, I think the interesting part of that plugin is about 4 lines of code, and the whole thing is around 30 lines of C code. So it's really not a lot of complexity there to add. Yeah, to do that. And then the final one is the control messages, this new $control topic. And the idea here is to implement, to allow plugins to register essentially a plugin API endpoint, which they will be able to receive messages on. They'll be the only plugin on that broker to be able to receive messages on that topic. So it gives you a method of interacting with your plugin to do whatever is required for changing configuration, for example. So as an example of that, we have the new dynamic security plugin. Now the idea of this is to produce a new authentication and authorization plugin that makes it much easier to deal with controlling your clients and access in a running broker than the current system allows. So at the moment, we have a number of third-party plugins that people have provided, which are really nice. The broker itself has a file-based password file and ACL file implementation, which allows you to work with, I think it's fair to say a small set of clients and access controls, because once you start getting to a larger number of clients, it gets a little bit unwieldy. It's not the best thing. Fine for at home, but not really, maybe much more than that. So this new plugin tries to get around those problems, but also in a way that doesn't require an external service. So what you have is role-based topic access control, and your users and devices will authenticate as a client in the plugin. And those clients, the authentication comes from a username and password, or optionally from a client ID, username and password triplet. You can assign your clients to different groups, a number of groups, and then the clients and groups are assigned to these roles to grant access to topics, and the roles then have lists of access controls for the different topics. And all of this is managed over a one of these new $control topic APIs, so it can all happen on the fly without any impact on the broker, and it's all persisted to disk, and it's all well, it's really rather quite nice, I think. So this diagram, it's not particularly complicated, but I think it's just worth covering anyway, just to show the relationship between the different roles and groups and clients. So I have 4 roles here defined, A, B, C, and D, which have got some ACLs in, which we'll cover on a next slide. And then different clients in different situations. So client A is just sat there on its own, not in any group. It's assigned to role A. So it's got all of the access defined in that role. Then we have clients B and C, which are all part of a group, Group A. And Group A has a role B assigned to it. So that means that both client B and C will have that role assigned to them as well. Or in addition, client C has a D role D that is assigned specifically just to it. So it's got 2 roles. And so I think you can see from those simple examples there, you've got a great deal of flexibility about how you could define these different roles. Although, of course, I would suggest that you should try and keep it as simple as possible. The final client down at the bottom is client D, and that is shown as an unauthenticated client. So it's perfectly valid with this plugin to have a mix of authenticated and unauthenticated clients, if you so wish. And the way that we deal with assigning roles to those clients is to have a group. You can specify a group that unauthenticated will be automatically assigned to. You can also, and that means that you can aggregate your unauthenticated effectively from your authenticated clients. Presumably, people who want a web view for some service, this kind of thing is going to be very useful for them. So I've mentioned the clients, the groups, and the roles. So the ACLs sit within the roles, and they apply to the different client events that occur when they're trying to communicate. So publishing, subscribing, and unsubscribing. And we've also split the publishing event down into 2 different types, which is when the client is sending a message to the broker or it is receiving a message from the broker. And there is, there's definite overlap between the subscribe event and the client receiving event. They're both about clients receiving messages, but the reason that publish client receiving event exists is 1, because that exists in the old mechanism, but 2, because it gives you greater flexibility in how you can split up your topic tree in the fewest number of access controls. So if you imagine, let me start again. So if you can stop a client from subscribing, that's always going to be the best strategy, because then fewer messages have to be processed through the broker. But you could imagine using a fairly broad subscribe ACL so that a client can subscribe to a wide range of topics, but then it isn't allowed access to a few of those topics within that tree, at which point you could deny access through this publish client receiving ACL type. And that is then going to be a lot easier for you to manage than having to define half a dozen different or a dozen different subscribe ACL types. So when an event occurs, so a subscribe event, subscribe request comes in, for example, then the ACLs for that client are searched in order for a matching topic. And the first matching topic, matching to an ACL that is found the result from that ACL is used, whether that's allow or deny. And if it's not found, then the default access applies. And so this is the, when you first set up, you get a default access that denies clients sending messages and subscribing to messages, but allows them to receive and unsubscribe. So it's restricting the important things and not making it too difficult for you to work with, so that clients can still unsubscribe. I don't suppose many people are going to want to stop clients unsubscribing, but the option is there if they choose it. You can change these default access values at any time to match what suits your needs the most. And I think I also need to mention about how the ACLs, what the order actually is that these ACLs are searched in, because that's quite important, because it is the first result that is found that is used. So whenever you add an ACL to a role, that will you assign that using you add that using a property using a priority, sorry, and that is a numerical value which determines the order in which the ACLs are searched for that particular ACL type. And the same applies when you add a role to a client or a group. There is a priority, so it determines which order those roles are searched. And likewise, when a client is added to a group, then within that client's group list, the group will have a particular priority. So it's completely deterministic about which order the ACLs are searched in, so that you can be completely sure about which ACL is going to trigger first. So there's no surprises there. Now, the publish and both of the publish ACL types are fairly straightforward. The subscribe and unsubscribe need a little bit more explanation, because they have two subtypes: the subscribe literal and the literal and the pattern, both for subscribe and unsubscribe. And this allows you, with the literal type, to match against a literal string that the client is trying to subscribe or unsubscribe to. So the example here is, if you deny access to the literal string hash, then a client will be unable to subscribe to that literal topic. So that means, for example, on a they wouldn't be able to do topic discovery like you might do on a public test broker, where subscribing to hash will give you a list of all of the topics, but you would still be able to subscribe to any specific topic, assuming that there are no other ACLs stopping you from doing that. The subscribe pattern and unsubscribe pattern ACL types, by contrast, allow you to match against a topic filter that's got wildcards in it. So if you deny access to the results /hash ACL topic, subscribing to the results topic or anything in the results tree, with the example above, if we did a subscribe pattern, clients would be able to subscribe to absolutely nothing in the normal topic tree. So the combination of these, I think, is quite useful as well. How are we doing for time? Okay, I better get a move on. How do we control the dynamic security plugin? So as I mentioned, we use this $control topic to send messages, and they come in the form of a JSON message. There's an example there, and then responses are sent to a response topic on the success or error. And all of those different commands are documented in the in a README in the repository at that address. So if you wish to integrate that with anything, then that's perfectly possible. But we also provide the Mosquito control command line utility to give a bit of a simpler access. So there's some examples there: creating clients, get client information, list the clients. You can enable and disable clients. So a disabled client can't connect; it will never be authenticated, but you don't have to delete it, and so on. And yeah, so there's documentation for that online. You can use that connect to remote brokers as well, with the appropriate encryption and authentication as well, of course. There is a further solution now provided by Sedalo, which is the management center for Mosquito. This is an open source project that's been developed, which is a web-based GUI for monitoring and managing a Mosquito instance. So you can monitor your $sys metrics, look at the topic tree, and importantly for what we're talking about right now, manage the dynamic security plugin. So there's links there for the installation and documentation. But I'm just going to show you some screenshots from that. So as I say, it's a web-based interface. This is just showing the client creation page. I've got a couple of clients there. You can see their name, the username and a descriptive name, the groups that they're in, and the specific client roles that have been assigned to them. Then moving on, there is the similar groups page showing the different groups, which clients are in them, which group roles have been assigned to them, and which group is set as the anonymous group. And then there's a similar page for the roles. This one here is showing adding an ACL to a role for a specific role. So you can see all of those, and in the priority order as well, of the different ACL types. So, I mean, I have to say it does make it very straightforward and pleasant to work with using this. Okay, so that's covered the end of the security and plugin side. So we're coming towards the end now. So in Mosquito 1.6, we introduced MQTT v5 support, but one area that was lacking was the bridge support for MQTT v5. So that's now been remedied. So bridges now support MQTT v5. So they give you access to, these are some of the features that specifically the bridges benefit from in v5. And of course, in the v3 specification, there was no facility for the bridge features really that were used. So that was, all the bridging was done on a non-spec feature. So some of the non-local message delivery was a non-standard feature that some brokers implemented and others didn't. So it's now now that we have v5 supported Mosquito, that's all fully spec compliant as well, which is nice. So just briefly then to mention the Mosquito clients, the command line utilities. There have been a few improvements there, such as adding Unix socket support, some more easy support for v5 features. But there's two things that I wanted to just highlight with Mosquito Sub, the subscribing command line client, which I think are useful for anybody who's using it to just to monitor a topic or a set of topics on a broker without not really processing it, just keeping a general eye on it. And those features are the random filter, which allows you to print only a certain percentage of the messages that are received. So you'll still always receive all of the messages for the topics that you subscribe to. But if you've got a very fast moving topic, then it's not really much use to use Mosquito Sub and keep on it, but watch it by eye. You can't really tell what's going on. So this allows you to essentially, so you can actually happening sampling of the message coming in. It's probably useful in this really fast, rapid moving data. In a similar sort of vein, making life easier for you looking at the data coming in, we've added support for output format specifiers for field width and precision for some of the different outputs. So this is some data that's come from test.mosquito.org, some metrics for various places in Germany of some sort. And so all the topics are different lengths. It's difficult to see where the data is. And so we can use the format specifiers to turn that into nice even columns and right justified instead of left justified. So it's a fairly minor addition, but I think it's quite nice for some situations. And that brings me to the end of my Mosquito overview. Thank you for listening. And if you've got any questions, please do answer them, ask them, and I'll answer them. So I can see there is one open question. Can the plugin decide to ignore messages after inspecting them? I'm not quite sure what you mean by ignore them. It's if you receive a message and don't do anything to it, then it will carry on through the broker as if the plugin wasn't doing anything. So I think that's probably what you mean. And obviously, you can choose which things to look at. Just look at the topics. You could look at the retain status. You can look at what QoS. It's entirely up to you. You may not be interested in the payload. Yes, hopefully that answers your question. Are there any enhanced authentication plugin examples? No, there aren't. But if you've got an example that you'd like to, of a particular service that you'd like to see that working with, then I'd be happy to take a look at that. Oh, did we? We had another. So I mean, I think we had a poll for future features for Mosquito, if that's available, maybe. So we have plans in mind for future versions of Mosquito, and we'll be sharing those in the coming weeks, I suppose. Yeah, but we are always interested to hear what other people think are priorities for them. But otherwise, if there are no more questions, then thank you very much for coming. I hope this was useful and interesting. And if you please go ahead and try out the things I've shown you and report back any feedback. That'll be great. And that's an easy question to answer. That's quite all right. Thank you very much. It's not necessarily the most friendly situation to be getting feedback from, is it? All right. Okay, I didn't see the. Sorry, I didn't see the chat.
Okay. We have the participants. I still see the participants.
Yes, I think they're still here. Sorry, I see Christoph asked a question about disk persistence improvements. So in the original plans for 2.0, we did have disk persistence improvement. This release originally wasn't going to be 2.0, but the changes to the security behavior required a change because it's a breaking change, and so that was changed, and so essentially that has been brought to a later version. Needs updating. What needs updating about that? Okay. So it seems as though the poll is not working for some reason in Zoom. So that's unfortunate, but can't be helped, I suppose. Okay, thank you then, and bye-bye.